The Sovereign's Vow. Act 6. Chapter 1. Peace, by now, had become the family's most familiar companion, decades of it settled so completely over Zekted and its allied kingdoms that even Drake's old, careful watchfulness had gradually softened into something closer to contentment. It was into that deep, comfortable quiet that the next disturbance finally arrived, not through any vanished village or shadow army, but through Issei herself, waking one night with a vision so vivid and so strange that she came directly to her father before the sun had even properly risen. I saw the weapons, she told Issei, still shaken, sitting with him in the quiet grey light of Ossel's kitchen while the rest of the household slept undisturbed. Not as they are now, bonded to us, but as they once were, long before any Vanitas ever carried them. I saw them being forged, Papa, by a single figure I could not properly see, and I heard a voice that felt older even than Drake's oldest memories, saying that the time of testing draws near again. Drake, listening carefully through the bond he shared with both father and daughter, went very still. I know that voice, the dragon admitted slowly, something in his ancient tone carrying a weight Issei had rarely heard from him. Or I know of it, rather, from fragments of memory so old I had long assumed them merely legend rather than true recollection. The one who first forged the 7 dragon weapons, before even the oldest kingdoms of this world existed. I did not believe such a being still watched this world, let alone still took interest in how its creations were ultimately wielded. What does it want? Issei asked, old instincts sharpening despite the many peaceful years since he had last needed them so urgently. I do not know, Drake admitted. But if it has begun reaching into Issei's dreams, much as the hunger once reached into all of your minds so many years ago, I suspect we are meant to understand that it intends, before long, to make its true purpose known directly. Chapter 2. The vision returned to Issei 3 more times over the following weeks, each iteration slightly clearer than the last, and it was during the 4th and final vision that the ancient forger finally spoke directly, its voice carrying through Issei's dream with a weight that left her trembling even hours after waking. 7 weapons, forged in an age this world has long since forgotten, the voice said, layered with a depth that felt less like the hunger's overlapping strangeness and more like something vast and singular speaking across an impossible span of years. I gave them to this world with a single purpose. To test whether mortal hearts, bound to power beyond their own nature, could learn to wield it wisely rather than be consumed by it. For centuries, I watched Vanitas rise and fall, some proving worthy, others proving tragically otherwise. I had not expected, in all that long watching, to see all 7 weapons gathered beneath a single household, bound not merely by duty but by genuine, chosen love. A pause, heavy with ancient consideration. Such convergence has happened only once before, in an age even older than my own clearest memory, and that convergence did not end well for the world that hosted it. I would know, before I allow this pattern to continue unchallenged, whether your family represents true wisdom, or merely a more elegant path toward the same old, tragic ending. Issei relayed the vision to the gathered family the following morning, and the council that followed carried a gravity the family had not properly felt since the Convergence Court's own formal summons years earlier. Another trial, Melitza said, characteristically direct even in the face of such an ancient and uncertain challenge. We have already proven ourselves before one ancient court. I do not relish proving it again before whatever this forger ultimately turns out to be. We are not the same family we were even a decade ago, Eleonora said, quiet but resolute. We have grown wiser, more numerous, more thoroughly tested by everything that has already come before us. If this forger means to judge us once more, let it find a family even more prepared to answer that judgment than we were the first time. Chapter 3. The forger's true summons arrived not as a formal document but as a sudden, complete stillness that settled over the entirety of Ossel one quiet afternoon, every dragon weapon in the household's possession flaring simultaneously with a light none of them had ever seen from their bonded weapons before. Gold and ancient and utterly without the familiar warmth each Vanitas had long since grown accustomed to feeling from her own particular bond. It is time, Drake said, his voice carrying an unusual formality that made the entire household pause in whatever they had been doing. The forger wishes to speak directly, and to judge for itself whether this convergence has grown wise enough to be trusted, or whether the pattern of tragedy it fears must finally be broken before it repeats itself once more. The 7 Vanitas gathered together in Assel's great hall, their bonded weapons glowing with that same strange, ancient light, and Issei, standing at the center of the gathered family alongside Eiko, whose own bond with Drake made her uniquely suited to help bridge whatever communication the forger intended, felt the old, familiar weight of a threshold about to be crossed settling once more over his chest. The light gathered slowly into a figure at the center of the hall, tall and formless in a way that made Issei's eyes water faintly whenever he tried to focus too directly upon it, radiating an authority and antiquity that made even Drake's own considerable presence feel, by comparison, almost young. 7 Vanitas, the forger said, its voice resonating not merely through the hall but through the very bond each woman shared with her own dragon weapon. And the mortal man who first drew them together into convergence, though I sense now that convergence has long since grown into something considerably deeper than any single man's doing alone. I have watched your family's journey with growing interest across these past years, testing you subtly where I could, observing how you responded to trials both ancient and unexpected. A pause, weighing something Issei could not properly name. I find myself, now, genuinely uncertain what judgment I ought to render. That uncertainty itself is rare enough that I have decided, rather than judge from a careful distance as I have watched countless convergences before yours, to offer instead a direct test, one final trial that will settle, once and for all, whether this family's convergence represents true wisdom or merely fortunate circumstance that has not yet been properly challenged. Chapter 4. The nature of the forger's proposed trial, once fully explained, proved considerably different from anything the family had faced in any of their previous confrontations, ancient or otherwise. I will not test your strength, the forger explained, its formless presence settling into something closer to stillness as it addressed the gathered family. Strength, I have already observed, your family possesses in abundance. Nor will I test your unity, which similarly requires no further demonstration after everything you have already survived together. Instead, I will test the one quality every previous tragic convergence ultimately lacked, the willingness to release power freely, should releasing it ever prove the wiser and more loving choice, rather than clinging to strength simply because strength has become comfortable and familiar. What exactly does that mean? Eleonora asked carefully. It means, the forger said, that I will offer each of you, individually, the choice to release your bonded weapon entirely, permanently, in exchange for a gift I believe each of you might value even more deeply than the power you currently carry. I will not say, in advance, what that gift shall be for each of you, only that it will be shaped precisely to what your own heart most deeply desires, beyond mere strength or duty. Should even a single one of you choose release over retention, I will judge your family's convergence properly wise, understanding that true wisdom lies not in the power one holds, but in the freedom to set that power down when love or wisdom genuinely calls for it. Should none of you choose release, I fear I will be forced to conclude that this convergence, however built on love, has nonetheless grown too attached to its own strength to be fully trusted with the power it carries. Drake, consulted immediately amid the sudden, weighty silence that followed the forger's explanation, offered careful, honest counsel. I cannot advise you on this choice, partner, nor can I tell any of your wives what their own hearts most deeply desire. This is not a test any of us can solve through strategy or careful preparation. It is simply a question each of you must answer honestly, for yourselves alone. Chapter 5. The days that followed brought a quiet, private reflection unlike anything the family had experienced even during their most desperate battles, each of the 7 Vanitas withdrawing, in her own way, to consider honestly what the forger's strange, weighty offer truly meant to her. It was Sophia who came to her decision first, finding Issei alone in Assel's garden on the 3rd morning after the forger's proposal, her expression carrying a calm, settled certainty that told him immediately she had already made peace with whatever she was about to say. I am going to release Narcissus, she said quietly, using the name of her own bonded weapon with a tenderness that made clear the decision had not come easily, despite her evident peace with it. I have spent my entire adult life healing others through power that was never truly, originally mine. I find myself wondering, now, what it might mean to heal simply as myself, without any weapon strength lending its aid, relying entirely on the skill and compassion I have built through my own effort alone. She looked at Issei carefully. I do not know what gift the forger intends to offer in exchange. But I find, honestly, that I am no longer afraid of finding out. Whatever it offers, I trust that it comes from a place of genuine respect for what I have chosen, rather than any attempt to manipulate that choice. Issei felt a swell of proud, complicated emotion at her quiet courage, and reached for her hand. Whatever happens, I'm proud of you. This can't be an easy thing to consider giving up, after everything Narcissus has meant to you. It is not easy, Sophia admitted. But I think, perhaps, that is precisely why it matters. Easy choices rarely prove much of anything about the heart, making them. Chapter 6. Sophia's formal release of her bonded weapon took place before the entire family the following evening, the forger's formless presence returning to Osso's great hall to witness the choice directly, and Issei watched with quiet, aching pride as Sophia knelt before the ancient light, speaking words of gratitude to the weapon that had served her so faithfully across more than 3 decades of healing work. Thank you, she said simply, for everything you helped me become. I release you now, not from any lack of gratitude, but because I have grown to trust my own hands and my own heart enough that I no longer need your strength to know I can still help the people I love. The weapon's familiar glow faded slowly, gently, and where it had once rested at Sophia's side, a small, unassuming stone remained instead, warm to the touch and radiating a quiet, comforting presence entirely unlike the weapon's former power. Your gift, the forger said, its voice carrying something that might have been approval, is simply this. A stone that will never fade, never require any bond or duty to maintain its warmth, offering healing not through ancient power but through the simple, renewable strength of your own compassion, amplified now permanently by the choice you have just freely made. You will find, I believe, that your hands have not lost their gift in releasing Narcissus. If anything, I suspect you will find them steadier than ever. Sophia, testing the stone's warmth with careful wonder, looked up at the forger with quiet, grateful astonishment. Thank you, she said again, this time for an entirely different gift than the one she had originally released. The forger's formless presence turned then, slowly, toward the rest of the gathered family, its ancient attention settling on each of the remaining 6 Vanitas in turn. One choice, freely made, it said. I confess myself already more inclined toward favorable judgment than I was before this trial began. But I would see this offer answered fully, by each of you, before rendering any final verdict on your family's true nature. Chapter 7. Ludmila made her own decision within the week, coming to it with the same careful, deliberate thoughtfulness she brought to every important choice in her life, and when she finally released Lavia's before the gathered family, her reasoning carried a quiet, powerful clarity of its own. I have spent my whole life needing to be strong, she explained, kneeling before the forger's ancient presence with the same fierce dignity she had carried since Issei first met her on that long-ago battlefield. Strong enough to protect Legnitz alone, strong enough to never need anyone else's help. Lavia's gave me that strength, and I do not regret a single day I carried it. But I have learned, across these past decades, that true strength was never truly about the ice I could command. It was about learning, slowly and sometimes painfully, to let others carry weight alongside me, rather than insisting on carrying it entirely alone. She looked toward Issei, toward her sister wives gathered close around her, toward the family that had taught her exactly that lesson across so many remarkable years. I release Lavia's now, trusting that the strength I have built within myself, and within this family, will prove more than sufficient without it. The forger's gift to Ludmila arrived not as any physical object but as a quiet, settled peace that visibly smoothed some long-held tension from her shoulders the moment Lavia's fully faded. Your gift, the forger explained, is simply the full and complete release of a burden you carried long before you ever bonded with Lavia's at all, the belief that your own worth depended entirely on your capacity for solitary strength. You will find, I think, that peace suits you rather better than the ice ever properly could. Valentina followed within days, her own release carrying the particular thoughtful precision that had defined her character since Issei first met her poring over ancient texts in her northern library. I release Sophia Berta's own namesake weapon, she said, a small, private joke shared only between herself and her longtime friend, before growing properly serious. I release Nachtigal, trusting that the knowledge I have spent my whole life gathering does not require ancient power to remain valuable, only careful, continued effort freely given. Her gift arrived as a permanent, effortless clarity of memory and understanding that she confessed, afterward, felt like finally setting down a weight she had not fully realized she had been carrying. Chapter 8. Melitza's release, when it finally came, arrived with all the characteristic bluntness she brought to every major decision in her life. I have thought about this for exactly as long as I needed to, she told the gathered family, barely a week after Valentina's own choice, which is to say, considerably less time than the rest of you apparently required. I release my weapon not from any careful, drawn-out soul-searching, but because I have simply decided, plainly and directly, that I trust this family and my own judgment more than I trust the comfort of familiar power. That is reason enough for me. Her gift, fittingly, arrived as an unshakable, permanent confidence that seemed to settle into her very bearing, and though Melitza characteristically dismissed any suggestion that she had needed such a gift in the first place, the rest of the family noted, with quiet affection, a new ease in her manner that suggested the forger's gift had touched something genuine beneath her usual brisk exterior. Elisavetta's own release followed soon after, carrying the same careful, hard-won vulnerability that had defined her entire journey into this family in the first place. I release my weapon, she said, because I spent so many years believing that strength alone could protect me from ever being hurt again. This family taught me otherwise. I no longer need Zelezvin to keep myself safe, because I have finally learned that true safety was never about strength at all. It was always about being properly, completely known and loved regardless of strength. Her gift arrived as a permanent, quiet warmth that visibly softened the careful reserve she had carried for so many decades, and Issei watched, deeply moved, as Elizaveta finally allowed herself to simply feel, without any careful guard remaining, the full and complete belonging she had once believed impossible for someone like herself. Chapter 9. Olga's decision, when she finally reached it, carried all the warm, generous spirit that had defined her character since Issei first arrived at her sun-warmed orchards so many decades earlier. I release Skuld, she announced cheerfully, though her eyes carried genuine, deep feeling beneath the characteristic warmth of her tone, because I have spent my whole life believing that my worth to this family and to my province came from what I could give, what I could provide, what strength I could offer everyone else. I want to learn, now, what it feels like to simply be loved, exactly as I am, without needing to prove that worth through power at all. Her gift arrived as an overflowing, permanent joy that seemed to radiate outward from her very presence, and the household's children and grandchildren, gathered to witness the remarkable trial, immediately gravitated toward her with obvious, delighted affection, as though her gift had made visible something that had always been true about her but had never before been quite so completely unguarded. 6 of the 7 Vanitas had now released their bonded weapons, and the forger's ancient presence turned, finally, toward Eleonora, the last of the family still carrying her original bond. You have watched each of your sister wives make this choice, the forger observed. I would know now, Eleonora Volteria, what your own heart has decided. Eleonora was quiet for a long moment, looking around at her family, at 6 women who had each freely released the very power that had first defined so much of their identity, and at Issei, standing steady and supportive beside her exactly as he had since that very first morning on a lonely road so many decades earlier. I choose to keep Azendius, she said finally, her voice carrying quiet, complete certainty. Not because I fear releasing it, and not because I doubt the wisdom my sister wives have each shown in their own choices. I choose to keep it because I have realized, watching each of them choose release so freely, that true wisdom is not found only in the willingness to let go. It is found equally in the clear-eyed choice to keep carrying what genuinely still serves love and duty well, so long as that choice is made just as freely and just as thoughtfully as any release. Chapter 10. The forger's formless presence went very still at Eleonora's answer, a long, weighted silence stretching through Ossel's great hall as the ancient being considered a response that had, evidently, not matched whatever pattern it had originally expected from this final and most significant of the 7 choices. Explain your reasoning fully, the forger said finally, its voice carrying something that might have been genuine curiosity rather than mere formal judgment. Ossel needs a Vanitas, Eleonora said simply. Not because the province cannot survive without one, but because I have built my entire life around protecting these people, and I do not believe setting down that protection, simply to prove a point about wisdom, would actually serve them well. My sister wives released their weapons because doing so served love and wisdom more completely than keeping them would have. I have examined my own heart just as carefully, and found the opposite conclusion true for myself. Keeping is envious, continuing to serve and protect exactly as I always have, is the choice that best serves the people and the family I love. I do not believe true wisdom requires uniformity of choice, Forger. I believe it requires each of us choosing honestly, according to what our own hearts and our own duties genuinely call for. The Forger's ancient presence seemed to expand slightly, filling more of the hall with its formless, weighty light, and when it finally spoke again, its voice carried unmistakable, genuine respect. I confess, it said, I did not anticipate this answer, though I find, upon reflection, that it may prove the wisest of all 7 choices your family has offered me today. 6 of you released power freely, understanding that love sometimes calls for release. 1 of you kept power just as freely, understanding that love sometimes calls for its continued, faithful exercise instead. That balance, that willingness to choose differently from one another without any resentment or judgment passing between you, tells me more about your family's true character than uniform release ever could have. Chapter 11. The Forger's final judgment, when it came, settled over the gathered family with a weight and relief that left several of them openly weeping. I judge this convergence wise, the ancient being declared, its formless presence beginning, slowly, to gather itself back toward whatever distant existence it called home. Not because you proved yourselves all identical in your choices, but because each of you proved capable of choosing honestly, according to genuine wisdom rather than mere habit or fear. This is precisely the quality every previous tragic convergence lacked: individuals who clung to power out of simple, unexamined attachment rather than genuine, ongoing consideration of what love and duty actually required in each new season of their lives. A pause waited with ancient, final consideration. I release this family from any further trial. Your convergence stands not merely permitted, but honored, as proof that power held with such careful, examined love need never repeat the tragic patterns of ages past. As the Forger's presence finally faded entirely from Osso's great hall, the family remained gathered together in stunned, grateful silence for a long moment before the relief of it finally broke into warm, overwhelmed embraces. 6 women who had each freely released a piece of themselves they had carried for decades, and one who had just as freely chosen to keep carrying hers. All of them bound together more completely than ever by a trial that had, in the end, revealed nothing except the depth and honesty of the love they had built together. I am proud of every single one of you, Issei said, gathering his family close, his voice thick with emotion too large for easy words. Whatever you each chose, however different those choices ended up being from each other, I am so incredibly proud of the honesty and courage it took to make them. Chapter 12. The months that followed the Forger's trial brought their own quiet, gentle adjustment, 6 of the 7 Vanitas learning to navigate lives no longer defined by their ancient bonded weapons, discovering, exactly as the Forger's careful gifts had promised, that the strength and identity they had built across their remarkable lives had never truly depended on that power alone. Sophia's healing work, if anything, grew even more renowned across the following years, her steady hands and compassionate heart proving, exactly as the Forger had promised, entirely undiminished by Narcissa's absence. Ludmila found herself governing Legnitsa with a new, visible ease, the quiet peace of her gift settling permanently into a leadership style that had grown, if anything, more effective for its newfound gentleness. Valentina's scholarly work flourished under her permanent clarity of understanding, several major historical discoveries emerging from her northern archives in the years that followed that reshaped scholarly understanding of Zechtid's earliest history. Melitza's confidence, already considerable before the trial, settled into something even more assured, her leadership of the Alliance's military coordination growing steadily more respected across all 7 provinces. Elizavetta's newfound warmth transformed her relationships not merely within the family but across her entire province, her once carefully guarded people gradually learning to trust and love a Vanitas who had finally allowed herself to be properly, completely known. And Olga's overflowing joy became, if possible, even more infectious across the years that followed, her orchards growing into something of a pilgrimage site for anyone in need of simple, unguarded comfort and welcome. Eleonora alone continued her duties much as she always had, Isendius still bright and ready at her side, and it was during a quiet evening some months after the trial that she finally addressed, directly, the small, lingering uncertainty Issei had noticed occasionally crossing her expression since that remarkable day. "You are wondering if I made the right choice," she observed, settling beside him in their private garden. "A little," Issei admitted honestly. "Not because I doubt you. I just want to make sure you're at peace with it, especially watching everyone else find such clear, beautiful gifts through their own releases." "I am entirely at peace with it," Eleonora said firmly, though her expression softened at his evident care. "I did not keep Isendius because I feared release, Issei. I kept it because protecting Assel, protecting this family, remains the truest expression of who I am, exactly as healing remains true for Sophia even without her weapon, exactly as scholarship remains true for Valentina even with her newfound clarity. My gift was never going to be found in release, because release was never what my own heart actually required. My gift was simply the forger's confirmation that continuing to serve exactly as I always have was, itself, a wise and loving choice, freely and honestly made." Chapter 13. The family gathered once more, as they so often did across the passing seasons, in Assel's great hall, and Issei, looking around at everyone this extraordinary trial had ultimately revealed them to be, felt a particular, settled gratitude that even the earlier decades of remarkable challenges had never quite offered him in exactly this shape. "I keep thinking," he told the gathered family, "about what the forger said. About how the trial wasn't really about whether you kept your weapons or released them. It was about whether you could each choose honestly, for yourselves, without needing to match each other's choices just to feel like you belong." He looked around at his 7 wives, at children and grandchildren who had grown up watching this remarkable family navigate every kind of trial imaginable with exactly that same honest, individual courage. "I think that's kind of been the whole secret this entire time, actually. Not that we're all the same, or that we all want exactly the same things. Just that we've always trusted each other enough to choose honestly, and to support whatever that honest choice turns out to be. That is, I think," Sophia said softly, her stone still warm and steady at her side, "the truest lesson this family has ever taught, long before the forger ever arrived to formally test it. Love was never about uniformity, Issei. It was always simply about honesty, freely given and freely honored in return." Around the hall, 7 voices rose in warm, overlapping agreement, 6 weapons released and 1 still faithfully carried, an entire family bound not by matching choices but by matching honesty, and Issei, surrounded once more by everything this extraordinary journey had taught him across so many remarkable decades, understood, with complete and settled certainty, that whatever future trials still waited, however ancient or however unexpected, this family, built on exactly this kind of honest, chosen love, would meet them exactly as they always had, together, each in their own true way, and more completely home than ever before. Chapter 14. Word of the forger's trial and its remarkable outcome spread, in time, well beyond Assel's own borders, and it was not long before scholars and diplomats from across both Sected and Brunn, along with occasional curious representatives from the more distant kingdoms that had first taken academic interest in the family's convergence, began arriving in growing numbers, eager to understand exactly what the trial had revealed and what it might mean for how such ancient power ought properly to be understood and governed going forward. It was Iko, her own bond with Drake granting her a unique perspective on the whole remarkable affair, who ultimately took up the task of formally documenting the family's experience for the benefit of scholars and future generations alike, spending months carefully interviewing each of her parents about their individual choices and the gifts that had followed. "I want it recorded honestly," she told her father, during one of their many long conversations on the subject. "Not simplified into some tidy moral lesson, but preserved exactly as complicated and as individual as it actually was. I think that honesty matters more than any clean narrative scholars might prefer to construct around it. Issei, watching his daughter's careful, thoughtful work unfold over those months, found himself struck once again by how completely she had grown into her own remarkable person, distinct from either of her parents yet carrying forward the very best of what each of them had taught her. You know, he told her, one evening as she reviewed her careful notes by lamplight, I think you might understand what happened during that trial better than any of us who actually lived through it. You've got this way of seeing the whole picture that the rest of us were probably too close to properly notice at the time. Aiko smiled, setting down her notes for a moment. I had good teachers, she said simply. Every single one of you, in your own way, taught me exactly how to look for the honest truth underneath whatever story seems simplest on the surface. I'm just trying to honor that, the same way you all honored honesty during the trial itself. Chapter 15. The scholarly record Aiko ultimately produced, formally titled An Account of what she called the 7 Honest Choices, became, over the following years, required study not merely among Zektid's own scholars but across an increasingly wide network of kingdoms and courts that had taken interest in the family's remarkable convergence. And it was during a formal presentation of her completed work before the capital's own royal court that Aiko found herself facing a question that struck rather closer to home than most of the academic inquiries she had grown accustomed to fielding. You yourself carry a bond with the ancient dragon Drake, one of the assembled scholars observed, studying her with evident, careful curiosity. Have you considered what your own choice might someday be, should the forger or some similar ancient power ever offer you the same trial your parents faced? Aiko considered the question seriously, exactly as she considered every question put honestly before her. I think about it sometimes, she admitted. But I don't think I could properly answer it in advance, any more than my parents could have answered it before actually facing the choice themselves. I think that's rather the whole point of what the trial revealed. You cannot know your own honest answer to such a question until the moment genuinely arrives and asks it of you directly. The answer, thoughtful and unpretentious, seemed to satisfy the gathered scholars considerably, and it was during the quiet celebration that followed the successful presentation that Issei found himself pulled aside by Eleonora, both of them watching their daughter field question after question with the same calm, honest grace that had defined her character since childhood. She has grown into someone truly remarkable, Eleonora observed softly, unmistakable maternal pride coloring every word. I do not think either of us could have properly predicted, on the day she was born, exactly what kind of woman she would eventually become. No, Issei agreed, watching his daughter with the same swelling pride. But I think that's true of pretty much everything about this whole life, honestly. None of it turned out exactly like I expected. It turned out better. Chapter 16. It was nearly 2 years after the forger's trial that a new and unexpected challenge arrived, though this one carried none of the ancient weight or cosmic significance of the family's previous confrontations, arriving instead through entirely ordinary political channels in the shape of a formal request from a kingdom neither Issei nor any of his wives had previously had significant dealings with. A distant southern nation called Saxstein that had, according to the careful diplomatic correspondence, recently suffered its own encounter with strange, boundary-testing phenomena similar to what the family had faced years earlier with both the ancient hunger and the shifting trading realm. They request our direct counsel, Sakura explained, having been the one to first receive and translate the formal diplomatic correspondence through her own considerable experience with Brune's court. Not merely written advice, but the family's own direct presence, to help them understand and properly address whatever threat has begun testing their own kingdom's boundaries. The council that followed reached swift agreement that such a request, coming from a kingdom with no prior history of alliance, or even significant contact with Zektid, deserved careful, generous response, both for the genuine humanitarian value of helping a struggling kingdom and for the broader diplomatic value of extending the family's hard-won wisdom and experience to a wider circle of allies across the continent. I think we should go, Eleonora said, studying the formal request with careful consideration. Not the entire family, perhaps, given how many responsibilities keep the rest of us properly occupied here. But a smaller delegation, offering what genuine help we can, exactly as this family has always tried to do whenever such genuine need has presented itself. It was ultimately decided that Issei himself, along with Iko and her own bond with Drake, would travel south to Saxstein, accompanied by a small honor guard and Sakura's own considerable diplomatic skill, to properly assess and address whatever challenge the distant kingdom now faced. Chapter 17. The journey to Saxstein took the better part of a month, through territory none of them had previously traveled, and Issei found himself, watching unfamiliar landscapes pass beneath their careful, steady progress, struck by how different this journey felt from the desperate, urgent travels of his earlier years, this time undertaken not in crisis but in careful, considered generosity, offering hard-won wisdom rather than simply fighting for survival. Saxstein itself proved a proud, ancient kingdom considerably different in character from either Zechtid or Brunn, its people practicing customs and traditions Issei found himself genuinely fascinated to learn about during the careful weeks of diplomatic negotiation that preceded any direct action against the threat troubling their borders. Our own histories speak of dragon-bound warriors, much as your own kingdom's Vanadis tradition describes, Saxstein's ruling council explained, during a formal audience that stretched long into the kingdom's first evening of hospitality. Though our own tradition faded generations ago, the bonds broken or lost through circumstances our oldest records no longer properly preserve. We hoped, in reaching out to your remarkable family, that your own experience with such ancient power might help us understand what now tests our borders, and how it might best be properly addressed. It was Iko, drawing on her own bond with Drake and her careful scholarly training, who first identified the true nature of Saxstein's growing crisis, a working similar in some ways to the Hunger's old, patient testing of boundaries, though distinct enough in its particular signature that Drake himself required several careful days of study before offering confident assessment. This is not the same hunger we once faced, nor any presence I have personally encountered before, the dragon explained, once his careful study had finally concluded. But it shares certain qualities with threats I have heard described in older legends, presences that arise not from any single malicious will but from the simple, dangerous consequence of ancient bonds broken carelessly rather than released with proper wisdom and care, exactly as your own family so recently demonstrated during the forger's trial. Chapter 18. The revelation that Saxstein's crisis stemmed from generations of carelessly broken ancient bonds, rather than any external threat testing their borders from beyond the world's edge, reframed the entire nature of the challenge, and Issei found himself, working alongside Ika and Saxstein's own scholars, piecing together a working meant not to fight or negotiate with any external presence, but to properly heal and resolve the accumulated consequence of centuries of ancestors who had, through fear or ignorance, severed their own dragon bonds without ever properly understanding what such severance ultimately required. They did not know, Iko explained to the gathered Saxstein council, her voice carrying the same calm, thoughtful authority that had defined her scholarly work back home. Generations ago, when your kingdom's dragon-bound warriors began releasing their bonds, whether through fear or simple loss of tradition, they did so without the careful, examined wisdom my own family only recently learned to properly exercise ourselves. Power released carelessly, rather than freely and wisely surrendered, does not simply vanish. It lingers unresolved, seeking some proper conclusion it was never given the chance to find. The working required to finally, properly resolve that lingering, unfinished power took the better part of 2 months to prepare, drawing on the combined effort of Saxstein's own scholars and priests alongside Issei and Iko's own careful guidance, and it was during the working's final, delicate completion that Drake offered his own quiet, grateful observation on exactly what the family's own hard-won trial had ultimately made possible. We could not have properly helped this kingdom, the dragon said, had your own family not first learned, through the forger's careful trial, exactly what genuine, examined release actually requires. I do not think it coincidence, partner, that this opportunity to help arrived so soon after your own family completed that very lesson. Wisdom hard won in one place has a way of proving useful in places its original bearers never expected to carry it. Chapter 19. The working's completion brought immediate, visible relief to Saxstein's long-troubled borders, the strange, boundary-testing phenomena finally settling into permanent stillness, and the celebration that followed, though considerably more modest than the grand festivities that had once marked the family's own earlier victories, carried within it a particular quiet satisfaction that Issei found himself treasuring deeply as their small delegation finally prepared for the long journey home. "Thank you," Sackstein's ruling council told them, during a formal farewell that carried genuine, heartfelt gratitude rather than mere diplomatic formality. "Your family's willingness to travel so far, to offer such careful, patient help to a kingdom you had no prior obligation toward, will not be forgotten. We would count ourselves honored to consider Zektid a genuine and lasting friend, should your own kingdom ever have need of whatever assistance Sackstein might someday offer in return." The journey home passed more swiftly than the journey south had, familiar landscapes gradually replacing unfamiliar ones as their small delegation finally crossed back into Zektid's own borders, and it was during one of the final evenings of travel, father and daughter sharing a quiet fire beneath unfamiliar stars one final time before returning to the family waiting for them in Ossel, that Eiko finally voiced something that had clearly been settling in her thoughts across the long weeks of their journey. "I understand now," she said quietly, "why you built the life you built, Papa. Not just the family, though that's obviously the heart of it. But the way you've always chosen to help wherever help is genuinely needed, even when it costs time and effort you could have spent simply enjoying the peace you'd already earned." She looked at him across the fire, something warm and settled in her expression. "I want to build my own life around that same choice, I think. Not exactly the same shape as yours, obviously. But that same heart underneath it." Issei felt his own heart swell with a pride too large for easy words, watching his daughter across the quiet fire, understanding, with complete and grateful certainty, that whatever legacy this extraordinary family ultimately left behind, it would continue forward, generation after generation, carried by hearts that had learned, through decades of hard-won example, exactly what genuine, chosen love actually looked like in practice. "I couldn't ask for anything more than that," he told her softly, and together, father and daughter, they sat quietly beneath the stars, already looking forward to the warm, familiar welcome waiting for them at the end of their long journey home. Chapter 20. Their return to Ossel brought the same warm, overwhelming welcome that had greeted every homecoming across the family's remarkable decades together. 7 wives and a household full of children and grandchildren gathering close around Issei and Eiko the moment word of their arrival reached the Great Hall, and it was several days before the full, careful account of their journey to Sackstein had been properly shared with everyone eager to hear it. "You helped an entire kingdom heal centuries of carelessly broken bonds," Sophia said, wonder evident in her voice as she listened to Eiko's careful, thorough account of the working they had completed. "That is remarkable, Eiko. Truly remarkable. I had good teaching to draw on," Eiko said, glancing warmly toward her father. "Everything I understood about properly releasing power, about the difference between careless severance and genuine, wise surrender, all of it came directly from watching this family's own trial. I simply carried that understanding somewhere it happened to be needed." It was Eleonora, listening with quiet, careful attention throughout the account, who finally raised a question that seemed to have been building in her thoughts since Eiko first began her telling. "Do you believe," she asked, "that Sackstein's crisis was truly unique, or do you suspect other kingdoms across this continent might carry similar unresolved consequences from their own ancient bonds, broken carelessly across the centuries?" Drake, consulted on the matter, offered careful, sobering consideration. "It is entirely possible," the dragon admitted. Sackstein's tradition of dragon-bound warriors was hardly unique in this world's history, merely one example among what I suspect were once many such traditions across many kingdoms, most now faded into legend and half-remembered custom. If even a portion of those faded traditions ended in the same careless severance that troubled Sackstein, there may well be other kingdoms carrying similar unresolved consequences, whether or not they have yet recognized the true source of whatever troubles their own borders. Chapter 21. The implications of Drake's careful assessment settled over the family with a particular weight, the possibility that their hard-won wisdom might prove useful not merely to a single distant kingdom but to a much wider circle of nations across the continent, and it was during the careful counsel that followed that the shape of a new, ongoing purpose began, gradually, to take form. "We could not possibly travel personally to every kingdom that might carry such unresolved consequences," Valentina observed, ever practical in her consideration of the matter. "But we could, perhaps, properly document and share what we have learned, both through the forger's trial and through Iko's work in Saxstein, in a form that other kingdoms' own scholars and healers might study and apply without requiring our own direct presence for every single case. The proposal, refined carefully over the following weeks, ultimately took shape as what the family began calling the Convergence Accord, a formal body of careful, documented wisdom regarding ancient bonds, their proper formation, their proper release, and the consequences that followed when such bonds were severed without appropriate care. Made freely available to any kingdom or scholar across the continent who wished to study and apply it toward their own particular circumstances. Iko, given her considerable role in both the original trial's documentation and the practical application of that wisdom in Saxstein, took up formal leadership of the growing Accord's ongoing work, and it was during the Accord's own formal establishment, celebrated with considerably less fanfare than the family's earlier trials but no less meaningful for its quieter character, that Issei found himself reflecting, once again, on exactly how far this extraordinary journey had carried them all. "We started this whole thing just trying to survive," he told Eleonora, watching their daughter formally address a gathering of scholars and diplomats from across both Sechtid and Brunn, along with several representatives from Saxstein and, increasingly, other distant kingdoms eager to learn from the family's hard-won example. "Now we're teaching other kingdoms how to build the same kind of wisdom we had to learn the hard way. I don't think I ever could have imagined that, back when this whole journey started." Chapter 22. The Convergence Accord's work expanded steadily over the following years, Iko traveling increasingly widely to help other kingdoms understand and apply the family's hard-won wisdom, and it was during one such journey, to a kingdom considerably further from Sechtid than even Saxstein had been, that she finally forged her own particular path forward. One that carried the family's legacy into an entirely new generation's own remarkable story. She wrote home regularly during her travels, careful letters full of the same thoughtful, honest observation that had defined her character since childhood, and it was in one such letter, arriving nearly 3 years after the Accord's formal establishment, that she shared news that brought the entire family to warm, delighted celebration. "I have met someone," she wrote, "a scholar from this kingdom, much as Aya's own husband was once a scholar from the Convergence Court. His name is Kestrel, and he has spent his own life studying exactly the kind of ancient bonds and broken traditions the Accord now exists to properly address. I did not expect, traveling so far from home in service of this work, to find something quite so personally significant alongside it. But I find myself, now, genuinely hoping this family might soon welcome one more addition to its already remarkable, ever-expanding legacy." The wedding that followed, held in the distant kingdom where Iko had found her own particular happiness, brought the family traveling further from Oslo than they had journeyed in years, and Issei, watching his eldest daughter exchange vows with a partner who clearly understood and valued exactly the same principles that had defined her own remarkable life's work, found himself struck once more by the sheer, accumulated wonder of everything this extraordinary family had grown to encompass. "She built her own version of exactly what we built," Eleonora observed softly, watching their daughter's clearly joyful ceremony unfold. "Not identical, but true to the same heart underneath it. I do not think we could ask for any greater legacy than that." Chapter 23. The years that followed brought the family's remarkable story into its own settled, generational rhythm, the Convergence Accord's work continuing to expand under Iko's careful leadership, other kingdoms across the continent gradually adopting the family's hard-won wisdom regarding ancient power and its proper, honest stewardship, and Issei, growing older now with each passing season but no less grateful for every single day of the extraordinary journey that had brought him here, found himself, on a quiet evening, gathered once more with his entire family in Oslo's great hall, struck by the particular, settled piece of a legacy that had grown, across so many remarkable decades, into something far larger and far more lasting than he could have properly imagined on that very first disorienting morning so long ago. "Grandpa," one of the younger grandchildren asked, settling into his lap with the same easy trust every generation of this family seemed to carry instinctively, "is it true that you helped teach an entire kingdom how to properly let go of ancient magic?" Issei smiled, settling the child comfortably against his chest, and looked around at his gathered family, 7 wives, 6 of whom carried the quiet, settled gifts of their own honest choices rather than ancient weapons, one who still carried hers with the same faithful, examined devotion she always had. Children and grandchildren who would carry this family's remarkable legacy forward into a future none of them could yet properly imagine. Sort of, he said, laughing softly at the simplified, childlike framing of such a complicated, meaningful journey. Really, we just learned something true about ourselves first, and then we got to share that truth with people who needed to hear it. That's kind of been the whole story this entire time, actually. Learning something real, and then finding people to share it with. Around him, the family settled into comfortable, familiar quiet. Generations of chosen love and hard-won wisdom gathered together beneath Issei's warm, welcoming roof, and Issei, surrounded by everything this extraordinary life had grown to hold, understood, with complete and grateful certainty, that whatever future trials still waited, however ancient or however unexpected, this family, built on nothing more or less than honest, chosen love freely given and faithfully returned, would meet them. Exactly as they always had. Together, honestly, and generation after generation, more completely and more beautifully home than any of them could have ever properly imagined on that very first extraordinary morning when a stranger simply fell out of the sky and chose, without fully understanding what that choice would someday grow to mean, to stop and help. Chapter 24. It was Kaido, visiting Issei with his own growing family not long after Aiko's own wedding, who first raised the question that had apparently been quietly building among the second generation for some time. We have all watched the two of you build this remarkable legacy, he said to his parents one evening, gesturing to encompass not merely Issei and Ludmila but the entire gathered household of 7 wives and their extended family. Aiko has taken up the Accord's work, carrying that particular thread forward in her own way. But I find myself wondering, sometimes, what the rest of us are meant to carry forward, those of us who did not inherit a dragon bond or a scholar's particular calling toward ancient mysteries. Issei considered the question carefully, recognizing in it an echo of uncertainty he himself had once carried, decades earlier, before he had properly understood what kind of legacy truly mattered most. I don't think the Accord, or the dragon bonds, or any of the specific things we ended up doing, were ever really the actual legacy, he said slowly, working through the thought as he spoke it aloud. Those were just the shape our particular calling happened to take, given everything we ran into along the way. The real legacy was always just, choosing honestly, loving completely, showing up for the people who need you even when it's difficult. You've already been doing that, Kaido, every single day you've served Legnitsa and raised your own family with the same care your mother raised you with. That's not a smaller inheritance than Aiko's. It's just a different shape of the exact same thing. Ludmila, listening with evident pride, reached for her son's hand. Your father is right, she said. I did not release Lavias and find peace so that my children would feel obligated to chase ancient mysteries or cosmic trials of their own. I did it so that all of you might understand, watching us, exactly how to choose honestly for yourselves, whatever shape that honesty ultimately takes in your own particular lives. Chapter 25. The gathering that evening stretched long into the night. 3 generations of the remarkable family Issei and his 7 wives had built together across more than 4 decades of chosen love and hard-won wisdom, sharing stories and laughter and the particular, settled warmth of a legacy that had grown, across so many extraordinary years, into something far larger and far more varied than any single grand narrative could properly capture. Issei found himself, near the evening's quiet end, standing once more on the familiar wall where so much of this extraordinary journey had first taken shape, Eleonora beside him as she so often had been across their entire shared lifetime, both of them simply watching the stars in comfortable, contented silence. Kaido's question stayed with me, Issei admitted eventually. Made me think about everything differently, honestly. All these years, I kept thinking about the big dramatic moments, the trials and the battles and the ancient courts. But I think the real legacy was always the small stuff. Showing up. Choosing honesty. Loving people well, every single ordinary day, not just during the big dramatic tests. That has always been the truest foundation, Eleonora agreed softly. The trials simply revealed what was already true, day by day, in the quiet, ordinary choices that built this family long before any ancient power ever thought to test it. She leaned into him, The same easy warmth that had defined their bond since its very first tentative beginning so many decades earlier. I think, perhaps, that is the real reason the forger judged us wise. Not because of any single dramatic choice made under its direct observation, but because of decades of small, honest choices that had already shaped exactly who each of us had become, long before that particular test ever arrived. Issei pulled her close, looking out over Ossel's sleeping city one final time before they finally turned to make their way back toward the warm, waiting halls where their entire remarkable family slept soundly, safe and loved and utterly certain of exactly how completely they belonged. Together, he said quietly, the same simple word that had carried this family through every single trial and every single triumph across their entire extraordinary shared journey. However many more chapters this story still has left to write. And beneath a sky bright with familiar, faithful stars, home, exactly as it had always been meant to be, continued quietly on. The Sovereign's Vow. Act 7, Chapter 1. The peace that had settled so completely over the family's extraordinary legacy in the years following the forger's trial carried, as peace so often did in this remarkable life, its own quiet vulnerability, one that finally made itself known through channels none of them had properly anticipated. Arriving not through ancient courts or ancient hungers but through the very knowledge the family had worked so hard to share freely across the continent. It began with a report from Sackstein, carried by urgent messenger to Ossel nearly 5 years after Issei had first helped that distant kingdom heal its own centuries of carelessly broken dragon bonds. A faction within Sackstein's own borders, the report explained, had studied the Convergence Accord's careful documentation not to properly heal ancient bonds, but to deliberately, artificially recreate the very consequences the Accord existed to prevent, discovering that the unresolved power lingering from improperly severed bonds could, if gathered and directed with sufficient ruthlessness, be weaponized into something considerably more dangerous than the original, accidental crisis had ever posed. They call themselves the Unbound Chorus, the messenger explained, still travel-worn from the urgent journey north. A faction that believes ancient power should serve ambition rather than restraint, and who view your family's own hard-won wisdom regarding release and restraint as weakness rather than strength. They have already gathered considerable strength through their deliberate, calculated misuse of exactly the knowledge the Accord once shared in good faith. Issei, called immediately to the family council upon the news's arrival, felt a particular, personal weight settle over her at the revelation. This is because of the Accord's own work, she said quietly, old guilt threading through her voice despite the clear absence of any true fault on her part. We shared that knowledge freely, trusting it would be used wisely. We did not properly account for the possibility that someone might study our own hard-won lessons simply to learn how to invert them. No wisdom shared freely can ever be perfectly protected from misuse, Drake said gently, sensing his bonded partner's distress. This is not a failure of your work, Issei. It is simply the ancient, familiar truth that power, once understood, can always be turned toward purposes its original teachers never intended. The proper response is not regret for having taught wisely, but resolve to now address, just as wisely, whatever consequence has grown from that teaching's misuse. Chapter 2. The family council that followed carried a gravity distinct from the ancient, cosmic trials they had faced in earlier years, this threat arising not from beyond the world's edge but from within their own hard-won legacy, twisted deliberately by mortal ambition rather than any ancient hunger's patient testing. We need to understand exactly what they have built before we can properly address it, Eleonora said, the same decisive authority that had carried the family through every previous crisis settling firmly over the gathered council. Sakura, your diplomatic contacts in Sackstein and beyond may prove invaluable in gathering proper intelligence before we commit to any particular course of action. Sakura, now a seasoned diplomat with decades of careful experience navigating exactly this kind of complicated, multi-kingdom crisis, nodded immediately. I will reach out through every proper channel available to me. But I would caution the family against assuming this will resolve through diplomacy alone. A faction willing to deliberately weaponize broken ancient bonds, understanding full well the danger such power represents, has already demonstrated a willingness to accept considerable risk in pursuit of whatever ambition drives them. It was Kaido, drawing on his own decades of military experience within Legnitsa's defensive forces, who raised the practical question of readiness that the rest of the council had been circling without quite addressing directly. If diplomacy fails, or proves insufficient, we need to understand exactly what threat we might ultimately face in more direct confrontation. 6 of you released your bonded weapons during the forger's trial. I do not doubt the gifts you each received in exchange carry genuine value, but I would understand clearly, before any crisis forces the question, exactly what strength this family can still bring to bear should direct conflict become unavoidable. The question landed with particular weight, 6 of the 7 Vanitas considering, for the first time in years, exactly what their choice during the forger's trial might mean should this new threat prove to require the kind of raw, combative strength their ancient weapons had once provided so readily. Chapter 3. I do not regret my choice, Sophia said carefully, once the weight of Kaito's question had settled properly over the gathered family, but I would be lying if I claimed I had not, in this particular moment, wondered whether Narcissa's healing strength might have proven useful against whatever threat now gathers in Saxstein. None of us regret our choices, Ludmila said, equally thoughtful. But Kaito raises a fair concern. We are not the same family, in terms of raw combative strength, that we were during our earlier confrontations. We must plan accordingly, rather than simply assuming our previous methods will translate directly to whatever this new threat ultimately requires. Drake, consulted carefully on the matter, offered measured, honest counsel. The gifts your sister wives received in exchange for their released weapons were never intended as combat replacements, precisely as Kaito suspects. They were gifts suited to peace, to healing, to wisdom, to exactly the kind of life this family has built across the years since the trial. This does not mean you stand defenseless, should conflict prove unavoidable. It means, rather, that this family's strength must now be understood differently than it once was, drawing more heavily on strategy, on the accumulated wisdom of decades, and on the considerable capability of the family's second generation, several of whom have built their own formidable strength quite independent of any dragon weapon at all. Aiko, her own bond with Drake still fully intact, straightened at the dragon's observation. Kaito's own military training, Sakura's diplomatic skill, my own bond, Aya's connection to the Convergence Court itself should we require its counsel again. This family's strength was never solely dependent on ancient weapons, even during the years when 6 of us carried them. We simply have not needed, until now, to properly rely on everything else we have also built across these years. Eleonora, still carrying Izendius with the same faithful, examined devotion she had chosen during the trial, nodded slowly. Then we approach this threat honestly, exactly as the forger once taught us. Not pretending we are unchanged from our earlier years, but properly understanding and mobilizing exactly the strength we genuinely possess now, in this present season of our family's remarkable story. Chapter 4. Sakura's careful diplomatic inquiries over the following weeks revealed a picture considerably more troubling than the family had initially feared, the Unbound Chorus proving not merely a fringe faction of misguided scholars but a genuinely organized movement, drawing support from disaffected nobles and desperate opportunists across several kingdoms who saw, in the faction's promise of weaponized ancient power, a path toward ambitions that legitimate channels had long denied them. They have already demonstrated their gathered strength twice, Sakura reported, during a follow-up council held nearly a month after the crisis first came to the family's attention. Once against a minor Saxstein noble house that resisted their growing influence, the house's own modest holdings simply overwhelmed by strength the chorus should not, by any reasonable measure, have possessed so quickly. Once against a small delegation of scholars who had begun investigating the chorus's activities too closely for the faction's comfort, the delegation's own careful protective wards apparently proving entirely insufficient against whatever weaponized power the chorus has learned to wield. They are growing bold, Melitza observed grimly, her characteristic directness cutting straight to the heart of the matter. And if they have already proven willing to strike against those who investigate or resist them, I do not believe simple diplomatic pressure will prove sufficient to halt their continued growth. It was Aya, drawing on her own connection to the Convergence Court through her scholar husband, who offered a piece of information that shifted the family's understanding of the crisis considerably. I have been in careful correspondence with the court regarding this matter, she explained. They confirmed that the chorus's weaponized power, while genuinely dangerous, remains fundamentally unstable, built on inverted principles that were never meant to sustain such deliberate, ongoing use. The court believes, though cannot yet confirm with full certainty, that the course's continued growth may eventually prove self-destructive, the weaponized power ultimately consuming its wielders from within rather than remaining safely controllable indefinitely. That is not necessarily comforting, Valentina observed carefully. An unstable, self-destructive power in the hands of ambitious, ruthless people may prove more dangerous in its final, desperate throes than a stable power ever could. Chapter 5. The family's careful deliberation ultimately settled on a course of action that balanced diplomatic caution with proper, prepared readiness, a formal delegation traveling to Sackstein once more, this time considerably larger and more prepared than Eiko's original journey years earlier, combining Sakura's diplomatic skill, Kaito's military expertise, Eiko's own bond with Drake, and Issei's own considerable accumulated wisdom and experience, all traveling together to properly assess and, if diplomacy proved insufficient, directly address the unbound chorus's growing threat. Eleonora, remaining behind to manage Ossel and the broader alliance's continued coordination alongside her remaining sister wives, offered careful counsel before the delegation's departure. Do not underestimate diplomacy's continued value, she said, even against a faction that has already demonstrated willingness toward violence. But do not, equally, underestimate the genuine danger this threat represents, simply because it lacks the ancient, cosmic scale of our earlier confrontations. Mortal ambition, properly weaponized, has proven dangerous throughout every age of this world's long history, quite independent of whatever ancient forces might separately test it. The journey to Sackstein passed more swiftly than Eiko's original journey years earlier, the delegation's larger size and more urgent purpose lending it a pace considerably brisker than the careful, exploratory travel of that first mission, and it was during the journey's final approach to Sackstein's capital that Drake offered his own careful, sobering assessment of what awaited them. I can sense the chorus's gathered power even from this distance, the dragon said, his ancient voice carrying genuine concern. It is considerable, and growing more unstable with each passing week, exactly as the Convergence Court suspected. I do not know how much longer such instability can be sustained before it either collapses entirely or, more dangerously, is deliberately released outward by wielders desperate to use it before it consumes them from within. Chapter 6. Sackstein's own ruling council, when the family's delegation finally arrived, received them with evident, grateful relief, the kingdom's own resources having proven increasingly strained by the chorus's continued growth despite months of careful internal effort to contain the faction's rising influence. They have grown too powerful for our own forces to properly address alone, Sackstein's ruling council explained, during the formal audience that opened the delegation's careful, urgent work. We had hoped, given your family's own hard-won experience with exactly this kind of ancient power, that your presence might help us finally turn the tide against the threat our own kingdom inadvertently helped create through our own carelessness generations past. Kaito, drawing on his considerable military experience, immediately set to work assessing Sackstein's own defensive capabilities and the chorus's demonstrated strength, while Sakura pursued every remaining diplomatic channel that might yet offer some path toward resolution short of direct confrontation. It was Issei and Eiko, though, who ultimately made first direct contact with the chorus itself, traveling under careful diplomatic protection to the faction's own stronghold in hopes of understanding, firsthand, exactly what ambition drove such dangerous, ultimately self-destructive pursuit of weaponized power. The chorus's leader, a sharp-featured woman named Iskra who had once, according to Sakura's careful research, been among Sackstein's own most promising scholars before her ambitions grew beyond what legitimate channels could satisfy, received them with evident, calculating interest rather than open hostility. The famous Dragon Knight, she said, studying Issei with sharp, assessing eyes that reminded him uncomfortably of Valentina's own early guardedness, though entirely without the warmth that guardedness had eventually revealed. And his daughter, architect of the very accord whose wisdom we have found so considerably more useful when properly inverted. I confess myself curious what brings you to my door, given your family's well-documented preference for release and restraint over the pursuit of genuine strength. Chapter 7. We're here because what you're doing is going to hurt people, Issei said plainly, foregoing whatever careful diplomatic preamble might have otherwise opened such a delicate confrontation. Not just the people you've already attacked. Yourselves too, eventually. The power you're gathering isn't stable, Iskra. It was never meant to be used the way you're using it. Iskra's sharp expression flickered with something that might have been genuine surprise at his directness, though she recovered quickly into her characteristic calculating composure. You assume I have not already considered that risk, she said. I have. Every member of the chorus who stands with me does so with full understanding of exactly what we risk in pursuit of what we believe truly matters. We do not share your family's comfortable conviction that restraint alone represents wisdom. We believe, rather, that a world governed by those willing to properly wield genuine, considerable power will ultimately prove more just than a world where such power remains carefully, timidly restrained by those too frightened of its proper use. Aiko, drawing on her own careful scholarly understanding of exactly what the chorus's inverted working truly represented, pressed the matter further. Your working is inherently unstable. Not because we fear its proper use, but because the very principles you inverted were never designed to sustain deliberate, ongoing weaponization. You are not simply choosing a different philosophy from ours, Iskra. You are pursuing something that will, mathematically and inevitably, eventually consume you and everyone who follows you, regardless of how carefully you believe you have accounted for that risk. For the first time since their arrival, something like genuine uncertainty flickered across Iskra's calculating expression, quickly suppressed but not, Issei suspected, entirely absent. Even if you are correct, she said finally, I do not believe simple restraint offers any better path forward for a world that has, across its long history, consistently proven itself unwilling to properly value or protect those without sufficient strength to demand such protection for themselves. I will not abandon this path simply because you claim, without proof I can properly verify, that it will eventually prove self-destructive. Chapter 8. The failure of direct diplomatic engagement, though not entirely unexpected given Iskra's evident, deeply held conviction, nonetheless left the delegation facing difficult choices about how to properly address a threat that diplomacy alone appeared unable to resolve. It was during the careful council that followed their return from the chorus's stronghold that Kaido finally offered the practical military assessment the rest of the delegation had been awaiting. Their gathered strength, while considerable, remains concentrated primarily around Iskra herself and a relatively small circle of her most committed followers, he explained, having spent the preceding days carefully studying every available report of the chorus's demonstrated capabilities. If we can find a way to properly isolate that concentrated strength, rather than confronting the chorus's broader, less committed membership directly, we may be able to address the true source of the threat without requiring the kind of large-scale confrontation that would risk considerable harm to Saxtine's own people caught in whatever conflict might otherwise unfold. Aiko, still turning over Iskra's own words from their earlier confrontation, offered a different, complementary consideration. I do not believe Iskra is entirely wrong about the world's failures toward those without power, she said slowly. I think, perhaps, our own approach must address not merely the immediate threat her chorus represents, but the genuine grievances that first drove her and her followers toward such a dangerous, ultimately self-destructive path. If we simply defeat the chorus without addressing what drove people to join it in the first place, I fear we will only delay rather than truly resolve the underlying crisis. Your daughter speaks wisely, Drake said, his ancient voice carrying evident approval. Every ancient threat this family has faced across the years has ultimately required not merely strength to overcome, but proper understanding of what genuinely needed addressing beneath the immediate crisis. I would counsel this family to pursue exactly that same wisdom now, addressing both the chorus's dangerous, unstable power and the legitimate grievances that first made such a dangerous path appear worth pursuing to those who ultimately joined it. Chapter 9. The plan that finally emerged from the delegation's careful deliberation combined Kaido's practical military strategy with Aiko's deeper understanding of the crisis's underlying causes, a careful approach meant to isolate and address Iskra's own concentrated, unstable power while simultaneously offering her broader followers a genuine, legitimate alternative to the dangerous path the chorus currently offered them. Saxtine's own ruling council, presented with the full plan, agreed to formally commit to broader reforms addressing exactly the grievances that had first made the chorus's promises appealing to so many of its followers: proper protection and support for those without sufficient wealth or standing to otherwise demand it, a commitment that Sakura's careful diplomatic work helped negotiate into binding formal policy rather than mere promise. With that broader commitment secured, the delegation turned to the more immediate challenge of properly isolating and addressing Iskra's own dangerous, unstable power before it could either collapse catastrophically or be deliberately unleashed in some final, desperate act. It was Issei himself, drawing on decades of accumulated experience facing threats both ancient and mortal, who finally proposed the approach that would ultimately prove decisive. "I want to talk to her one more time," he said, during the delegation's final council before committing to direct action. "Not to convince her she's wrong about everything. I don't think that's actually possible, not through simple argument alone. But I want her to understand, clearly and directly, exactly what's waiting for her and her people if they keep going down this path. Sometimes people need to hear the truth from someone who genuinely doesn't want to see them destroyed by their own choices, even when those choices are ones we can't ultimately support." Aiko, understanding immediately the particular kind of honest, compassionate confrontation her father intended, nodded slowly. "I will come with you," she said. "If the working truly is as unstable as I believe, I may be able to offer her concrete, verifiable proof rather than simply my own scholarly assessment. Sometimes people need evidence alongside genuine care, before they can properly reconsider a path they have already invested so much in pursuing." Chapter 10. Their final meeting with Iskra took place in the same stronghold as their first, though this time Aiko brought with her careful, detailed evidence of the working's inherent instability, gathered through weeks of careful study since their first confrontation, evidence that finally, slowly, began to crack through Iskra's previously unshakable conviction. "You said I could not prove this would eventually destroy you," Aiko said, laying out her careful research before Iskra's increasingly troubled attention. "I have proof now. 3 members of your own chorus have already shown early signs of exactly the kind of consumption I warned you about, symptoms your own healers have likely already noticed even if they have not yet properly understood their true cause or shared that understanding with you directly." Iskra's careful composure finally cracked, genuine alarm breaking through her calculating exterior for the first time since their initial meeting. "Show me," she said, and when Aiko's careful evidence proved, upon Iskra's own scholarly examination, entirely and troublingly accurate, something in the chorus leader's fierce, ambitious conviction finally began to properly waver. "I did not want this," Iskra admitted quietly, studying the evidence with growing, genuine horror. "I wanted strength, protection, a world that finally valued people like myself and my followers properly. I did not want to trade their lives for that goal, whatever risk I believed myself willing to personally accept on their behalf." "Then let us help you find a different path," Issei said gently, seeing in Iskra's genuine horror the same kind of wounded, desperate conviction he had witnessed, in various shapes, across so many decades of this remarkable journey. "Sackstein's council has already committed to real, binding reform, addressing exactly the grievances that first drove you and your people toward this dangerous path. That commitment is real, Iskra, not empty promise. I know that because my own family helped negotiate it directly. You don't have to keep pursuing power that's going to destroy the very people you're trying to protect. There's another way forward, if you're willing to consider it." Chapter 11. Iskra's eventual decision to dissolve the Unbound Chorus, formally announced before Sackstein's ruling council barely a month after that final, difficult conversation, did not resolve without considerable pain and complication, several of her more deeply committed followers refusing to accept the dissolution and splintering off into smaller, more radical factions that would require years of continued, careful attention from Sackstein's own authorities to properly address. But the crisis's central, most dangerous threat, Iskra's own concentrated and unstable power, was properly, safely resolved through a careful working that Aiko helped design, drawing on exactly the same principles of honest, examined release the family had learned through the forger's own trial years earlier. "I release this power," Iskra said, kneeling before the same careful working that had once, in a much grander and more ancient context, marked the family's own trial before the forger, not because I have abandoned everything I once believed mattered, but because I have learned, through your family's own hard-won example, that true strength was never found in power desperately, dangerously seized. It is found in the honest, difficult work of building something lasting and genuinely just, one careful, patient choice at a time. The dissolution of the chorus's most dangerous, unstable power brought immediate, visible relief to Sackstein's troubled borders, and though the kingdom's own work addressing the broader grievances that had first fueled the chorus's rise would continue for years to come, the immediate crisis had, at last, been properly and honestly resolved, not through simple defeat and destruction, but through exactly the kind of patient, examined wisdom the family had spent decades learning to properly practice. Issei, watching Iskra begin the long, difficult work of helping rebuild trust between her former followers and Sackstein's own authorities, felt a particular, complicated satisfaction settle over him, gratitude for a crisis properly resolved mingled with genuine compassion for a woman whose wounded, desperate conviction had led her so dangerously astray before finally, painfully, finding a better path forward. Chapter 12. The delegations returned to Oslo, several months after their initial departure, brought the same warm, grateful welcome that had greeted every homecoming across the family's remarkable decades together, and it was during the careful, thorough account that followed, shared with the entire gathered family across several long evenings, that Eleonora finally voiced the quiet, thoughtful observation that seemed to settle the crisis's true significance properly into the family's broader, ongoing legacy. This crisis was different from everything we faced before, she said, once the full account had finally been shared. Not ancient, not cosmic in scale, simply mortal ambition twisted by genuine, legitimate grievance into something dangerous. And yet I think, perhaps, it required exactly the same wisdom every previous crisis demanded of us. Honest understanding, patient compassion even toward those whose choices we cannot support, and the courage to address not merely the immediate danger but the deeper wounds that first made such danger appear worth pursuing. Aiko, still carrying some of the crisis's weight in her thoughtful expression, nodded slowly. I think I understand now, more completely than I did before, exactly why the Accord's work matters so much, and exactly why it will always carry some risk of misuse alongside its genuine value. Wisdom shared freely can always be turned toward purposes its teachers never intended. But I do not think that risk means we should stop sharing it. I think it simply means we must remain vigilant, ready to address misuse honestly and compassionately, exactly as this crisis required of us. Issei, listening to his daughter's careful, thoughtful reflection, felt the same swelling pride that had accompanied so many of her remarkable achievements across the years. You handled this crisis better than I think I could have, honestly, he told her. Not just the strategy, though that mattered plenty. The way you approached Iskra herself, with real evidence but also real compassion. That's not something you can just learn from books, Aiko. That's wisdom you built yourself, through your own honest choices across all these years. Chapter 13. The family gathered once more, in the quiet weeks that followed the delegation's return, in Oslo's Great Hall, and Issei, looking around at everyone this remarkable, difficult crisis had ultimately revealed them to be, felt a particular, settled gratitude that even this newest, most mortal and most complicated of their family's many trials had never quite offered him in exactly this shape before. I keep thinking about what Iskra said, he told the gathered family, about the world not properly valuing people without power to demand that value for themselves. I don't think she was wrong about that, honestly, even though I couldn't support the path she chose to address it. I think that's actually a big part of what this family's whole legacy should keep trying to do, going forward. Not just teaching people how to properly handle ancient power when they happen to have it, but helping build a world where people don't feel like they need to seize dangerous power in the first place, just to finally be treated with the dignity they deserved all along. That is, I think, Sakura said softly, her own diplomatic career built entirely around exactly that patient, careful work, the truest evolution of everything this family has always stood for. We began simply trying to survive ancient threats no one else could properly address. We are ending, or rather continuing, I suppose, since I do not think this family's story is anywhere near truly finished, trying to build a world where such threats, ancient or mortal, find less fertile ground to take root in at all. Around the hall, the family settled into warm, thoughtful agreement, a crisis mortal rather than ancient in origin resolved through exactly the same patient, examined wisdom that had carried this remarkable family through every previous trial, and Issei, surrounded once more by everything this extraordinary journey continued to teach him even after so many decades of remarkable, hard-won experience, understood, with complete and settled certainty, that whatever future chapters this family's story still had left to write, they would continue to write them exactly as they always had. Together, honestly, compassionately, and with every new trial properly and thoughtfully faced, more completely devoted to building a world worthy of the love this family had always chosen to practice. Chapter 14. The months that followed Sackstein's crisis brought a different kind of work to the family's ongoing legacy. One Sakura found herself increasingly leading alongside Aiko's continued stewardship of the Accord, a careful, deliberate effort to understand and address, proactively rather than reactively, exactly what conditions across the continent's many kingdoms might make dangerous factions like the Unbound Chorus appear appealing to those who otherwise had little reason to trust that legitimate channels would ever properly serve their genuine needs. We cannot simply wait for the next crisis to reveal itself before acting, Sakura explained, presenting her careful proposal before the full family council some months after the delegation's return from Sackstein. I propose expanding the Accord's work beyond merely documenting proper stewardship of ancient power, to include careful study and advocacy regarding the broader conditions that make such power's misuse appealing in the first place. Poverty, exclusion from legitimate authority, generational grievances left unaddressed by those with power to address them. These are not new problems this family invented or can single-handedly solve, but I believe our particular position, trusted across multiple kingdoms and carrying real influence through decades of hard-won credibility, gives us genuine opportunity to help address them more effectively than most. Eleonora, listening with careful consideration, found herself nodding slowly. This feels like a natural evolution of everything this family has already built, she said. We began by learning to properly steward power ourselves. We continued by teaching others to do the same. It seems only right that we now turn some portion of our efforts toward addressing why such power so often proves tempting to seize carelessly in the first place. The proposal, refined carefully over the following months, ultimately expanded into what the family began calling the Wider Accord, a broader initiative addressing not merely ancient bonds and their proper stewardship, but the deeper conditions of justice and dignity that Sakura had correctly identified as sitting beneath so much of the danger the family had spent decades learning to address. Chapter 15. It was during the Wider Accord's careful early development that Kaido, drawing on his own considerable military experience, raised a complementary concern that the family had not yet properly addressed despite everything they had already learned from the Sackstein crisis. Diplomacy and broader justice work will help prevent many future crises, he said, during a council gathered to discuss the family's continued evolution, but I do not believe we can responsibly assume every future threat will prove as amenable to patient, careful resolution as the Skir's chorus ultimately did. We were fortunate, this time, that reason and compassion proved sufficient. I would not wish this family caught unprepared, should some future threat prove less willing to reconsider its chosen path. The concern, though carrying none of the ancient family's earlier desperate urgency, nonetheless prompted careful, thoughtful consideration, and it was ultimately decided that Kaido himself would take up formal leadership of what the family began calling the Vigilant Watch, a coordinated effort across Sected Brune and their growing circle of allied kingdoms to properly monitor for early signs of exactly the kind of dangerous misuse the chorus had represented, allowing potential crises to be identified and addressed, wherever possible, before they grew into the kind of considerable, entrenched threat Sackstein's own kingdom had faced. I do not intend to build an army looking for enemies, Kaido clarified carefully, presenting his own proposal's careful scope before the gathered family. I intend to build a network of careful, trusted observers, much like Sakura's own diplomatic contacts, who can help identify concerning patterns early enough that patient, wise resolution remains genuinely possible, rather than allowing crises to grow unchecked until only more difficult, costly intervention remains available. Ludmila, watching her son present his careful, thoughtful proposal with obvious maternal pride, found herself reflecting on exactly how completely he had absorbed the family's hard-won lessons regarding the proper, wise use of strength and vigilance alike. "You have built something genuinely wise," she told him, once the council had concluded. "Strength held in careful reserve, ready but never eager, exactly as this family has always tried to practice across every trial we have faced." Chapter 16. The years that followed brought both the wider accord and the vigilant watch into steady, careful maturity, Sakura's diplomatic network growing to encompass an increasingly wide circle of kingdoms genuinely committed to addressing the deeper injustices that had once made the unbound chorus's dangerous promises appear worth the considerable risk they ultimately posed. While Kaido's careful observers helped identify and peacefully address several smaller, potential crises before they could grow into anything resembling Saxtian's own considerable difficulty. It was during one such early intervention, nearly 3 years after the chorus's dissolution, that Kaido's network first proved its genuine, practical value, identifying a small faction within a minor kingdom along Brune's own southern border that had begun, in early and still tentative fashion, studying similar principles to those the chorus had once weaponized so dangerously. "We caught it early enough that simple, honest conversation proved sufficient," Kaido reported to the family, following his own personal involvement in the careful, peaceful resolution of that budding crisis. The faction's leaders had not yet fully committed to the dangerous path Iskra once walked. A frank discussion of exactly where such a path ultimately leads, combined with genuine, credible commitment from their own kingdom's authorities to address the grievances driving their interest in such power, proved entirely sufficient to redirect their efforts toward legitimate channels instead. Issei, listening to his son's careful account, felt the particular, quiet satisfaction of watching hard-won wisdom properly translated into ongoing, practical protection for people the family would likely never personally meet. "You're doing exactly what this whole family has always tried to do," he told Kaido. "Not waiting for disaster, but showing up early enough that disaster never gets the chance to properly take root in the first place." "I learned that from watching all of you," Kaido said simply. "Every single crisis this family ever faced, the pattern was always the same underneath whatever particular shape the danger happened to take. Show up honestly, address the real problem rather than just the surface symptom, and never assume force alone will solve what genuine understanding and compassion might resolve more completely instead." Chapter 17. It was during this same period of steady, careful growth that Issei found himself, for the first time in many years, confronting the quiet reality of his own advancing age in a manner considerably more direct than the gentle, gradual awareness that had crept over him across the preceding decades. "You have been more tired lately," Eleonora observed one evening, watching him with the same careful, perceptive attention she had always brought to understanding him across their entire shared lifetime. "I do not say this to worry you unnecessarily, Issei. Simply to acknowledge what I think we both already know. You are not the same young man who once fell out of the sky into my path on that long distant road." Issei managed a tired, honest smile at the gentle observation. "No," he admitted. "I'm really not. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, actually. All of you look so much the same as you did decades ago, thanks to whatever the dragon weapons and, I guess, whatever Drake's own bond originally granted you. I don't think I ever properly asked whether that same protection extends to me." "It does, to a degree," Drake said carefully, sensing the direction of his partner's thoughts. "My own bond has slowed your aging considerably across these many decades, partner, though it has never entirely halted it the way the more direct bonds your wives once carried through their own dragon weapons did. You have lived, and will likely continue to live, a life considerably longer than an ordinary mortal's natural span. But you are not, and were never intended to be, entirely exempt from time's eventual claim." The revelation, though not entirely unexpected given the gradual changes Issei had noticed in himself over recent years, nonetheless settled with a particular, quiet weight over the evening's conversation. "I'm not scared," he told Eleonora honestly, after a long moment of careful consideration. "I've had an incredible life, more than I ever could have imagined possible. I just want to make sure, whenever my own time eventually comes, that I've properly prepared everyone for it, rather than leaving it as some sudden, unexpected loss nobody saw coming." Chapter 18. The conversation with Eleonora marked the beginning of a careful, thoughtful season in which Issei, without any immediate crisis forcing the matter, began deliberately ensuring that every piece of wisdom, every relationship, every unfinished thread of this extraordinary family's remarkable legacy received the kind of careful attention and closure that would allow whatever time remained to him to be spent as fully and as meaningfully as every other season of this remarkable journey had been. He spent long afternoons with each of his 7 wives individually, revisiting old memories and ensuring nothing important remained unspoken between them. He spent careful, patient hours with each of his children and grandchildren, passing along not merely practical wisdom but the deeper, harder to articulate understanding of exactly what had made this family's extraordinary journey so completely worth every difficulty it had ever required. "I don't want you to think this means I'm going anywhere soon," he told the gathered family, during one particular evening when the quiet, deliberate nature of his recent attention had clearly begun to worry several of the younger grandchildren. "Drake tells me I've probably got plenty of good years left, thanks to our bond. I just don't want to take any of those years for granted anymore, the way maybe I did a little, back when this whole extraordinary journey still felt like it would simply go on forever without any particular urgency behind it." Aiko, understanding perhaps more completely than most the particular wisdom behind her father's careful, deliberate attention, found herself reflecting on exactly what such honest acknowledgement of mortality's eventual claim actually taught the family, even amid the genuine sorrows such acknowledgement inevitably carried alongside it. "I think," she said, during a quiet conversation with her father not long after his initial revelation, "that this might be the most important lesson you've ever taught any of us, actually. Not through some grand trial or ancient confrontation, but simply through choosing to be honest about time, and choosing to spend whatever time remains as fully and as deliberately as possible, rather than waiting for some crisis to force that same honest reckoning." Chapter 19. The family's collective response to Issei's honest acknowledgement ultimately settled, over the following months, into a particular, deepened appreciation for exactly the kind of ordinary, treasured moments that had always formed the truest foundation of everything this extraordinary journey had built, gatherings that carried, now, a quiet awareness of their own preciousness that had, perhaps, always been present but had rarely before been quite so consciously, deliberately honored. It was during one such gathering, the entire multi-generational family assembled once more in Oslo's great hall for what had become a regular, treasured tradition of shared evening meals and stories, that Issei found himself, looking around at everyone this extraordinary life had grown to encompass, struck by a particular, settled gratitude that felt, somehow, even more complete than the gratitude he had carried across so many decades of remarkable journey already behind him. "I used to think," he told the gathered family, "that the big, dramatic moments were what really mattered most. The battles, the trials, the ancient courts and cosmic judgments. I still think those mattered, don't get me wrong. But I've come to understand, especially lately, that it was always these ordinary evenings, exactly like this one, that actually built everything worth protecting in the first place. The big dramatic moments just tested whether we properly built it. These quiet evenings are where the actual building happened, one small, honest choice at a time." Eleonora, reaching for his hand with the same easy, familiar warmth that had defined their bond since its very first tentative beginning so many decades earlier, offered her own quiet, heartfelt agreement. "That is, I think, the truest wisdom this entire extraordinary journey has ever offered us," she said softly. "Not found in any single grand trial, however meaningful, but built patiently, evening by ordinary evening, choice by honest choice, across an entire lifetime of chosen, faithful love." Around the hall, 7 wives, children and grandchildren spanning multiple generations, all gathered together in exactly the kind of warm, ordinary, treasured evening that had always formed this family's truest and most lasting legacy, and Issei, surrounded by everything this extraordinary life had grown to hold, understood, with complete and grateful certainty, that whatever time remained to him, however many more chapters this remarkable family's story still had left to write, every single one of them would be treasured exactly as fully and as deliberately as this precious, ordinary evening. Together, honestly, and for however many seasons still remained, more completely and more gratefully home than he had ever properly imagined possible on that very first extraordinary morning so many remarkable decades ago. Chapter 20. The years that followed Issei's honest acknowledgement of his own mortality brought, against whatever quiet apprehension the family had initially carried alongside that difficult conversation, a season of remarkable, sustained richness rather than any diminishment, the entire family finding, in their shared awareness of time's genuine preciousness, a deepened capacity for joy that had, perhaps, always been available to them but had rarely before been so consciously, deliberately cultivated. It was during this same season that Kaido and Aiko's own children, the family's third generation now beginning to reach adulthood, started taking up their own meaningful places within the Accord's continued work, young Ilya, Kaido's eldest son, showing particular aptitude for exactly the kind of careful, patient vigilance his father had built the watch around, while Aiko's own daughter, a thoughtful young woman named Marika who had inherited her mother's scholarly precision alongside something of her grandfather Issei's own easy warmth, began assisting with the broader Accord's careful documentation and diplomatic outreach. It is strange, Aiko admitted to her father, watching her own daughter present a careful, thoughtful proposal before the family council with obvious pride, watching this legacy continue forward into a generation that never knew this family before it had already become so thoroughly established. I sometimes wonder what Marika and her cousins truly understand about how uncertain and difficult everything felt, back when we were first building all of this from nothing more than hard-fought battles and desperate hope. They understand it through us, Issei said, watching his granddaughter with the same swelling pride that had accompanied every remarkable milestone across this extraordinary family's journey. Maybe not exactly the same way we lived it firsthand, but they carry it forward anyway, in how they choose to treat people, and how carefully they think through difficult problems instead of just reaching for easy answers. That's really all any of us can hope to properly pass down, I think. Not the exact same experiences, but the same underlying wisdom, translated into whatever shape each new generation needs it to take. Chapter 21. It was during a particularly memorable gathering, marking what had become an annual tradition of the entire extended family reuniting in Oslo for a full season's celebration, that the depth and breadth of everything this remarkable family had built across so many decades finally became fully, visibly apparent in a single, overwhelming moment. Representatives from Saxstein, now formally allied with Sected through bonds forged initially in crisis but sustained since through genuine, ongoing friendship, traveled north to join the celebration, Iskra herself among them, now serving as one of Saxstein's own trusted advisors on matters of justice and reform. Her own hard-won wisdom regarding the proper balance between legitimate ambition and dangerous overreach proving invaluable to her kingdom's continued, careful governance. I did not expect, all those years ago, she told Issei, during a quiet moment of the celebration's warm, extended festivities, that I would someday count myself grateful for the confrontation that once nearly destroyed everything I had built. But I find, looking back now, that your family's willingness to meet me with honest compassion rather than simple condemnation changed the entire course of my life, and I do not believe I could have found the path I eventually walked without that difficult, necessary intervention. I'm glad, Issei told her honestly. Really glad. That's kind of always been the whole point, I think. Not just winning against whatever threat happens to show up, but actually helping people find a better way forward, even when that better way isn't easy or immediate. Elsewhere in the gathered celebration, representatives from the Convergence Court itself, now regular and welcome guests at the family's significant occasions following their own formal recognition of the family's remarkable wisdom years earlier, mingled easily alongside scholars and diplomats from an ever-growing circle of allied kingdoms, all of them gathered together in genuine, warm celebration of exactly the kind of chosen, deliberate unity this extraordinary family had spent decades demonstrating was truly possible, even across vast differences of culture, history, and circumstance. Chapter 22. It was late into that same memorable celebration, the gathered crowds finally beginning to thin as the warm evening stretched toward its natural, contented close, that Issei found himself once more standing on the familiar wall overlooking Oslo's sleeping city, surrounded now not merely by Eleonora but by all 7 of his remarkable wives, gathered together in exactly the kind of quiet, treasured moment that had always meant more to him than any of the grander, more dramatic occasions this extraordinary journey had also included. Look at everything we built, Olga said softly, gesturing out toward the city below, toward the warm lights of a celebration still gently winding down, toward an entire legacy of alliance and wisdom and chosen love that had grown, across so many remarkable decades, to encompass far more than any of them could have properly imagined on that very first uncertain morning so long ago. I don't think I ever properly imagined it, Issei admitted, looking out over the same view with the same deep, settled wonder that had never quite faded across all these years. Not really. I knew I loved all of you. I knew this family mattered more to me than anything else in either of my two lives. But this, all of it, the accord and the watch and Sackstein's friendship and the court's own respect, I don't think I ever properly understood, back at the beginning, exactly how far a single choice to love honestly could eventually carry an entire family, and through that family, an entire world. Sophia, her healing stones still warm at her side after so many decades, reached for his hand with the same gentle warmth she had carried since their very first meeting on Pelesia's besieged walls. I do not think any of us properly understood it either, she said softly. I think that is rather the point, actually. We simply chose, each single day, to love as honestly and as completely as we knew how, and everything else, all of this remarkable legacy, grew naturally out of that simple, faithful choice, one ordinary day at a time. Around him, 7 wives gathered close in the warm evening air, decades of chosen love and hard-won wisdom settled comfortably between them, and Issei, surrounded by everything this extraordinary journey had taught him across so many remarkable years, felt, one final time that evening, the same overwhelming, grateful wonder that had first settled over him on that distant, disorienting morning when a stranger had simply fallen out of the sky and chosen, without fully understanding what that single choice would someday grow to mean, to stop and help a woman he had no obligation whatsoever to save, together, always, exactly as they had chosen to be from that very first extraordinary morning onward, and with every single new season this remarkable family continued to build, more completely and more beautifully home than words alone could ever properly capture. Chapter 23. In the quiet weeks that followed the great celebration, as the extended family gradually returned to their own provinces and their own particular corners of the remarkable legacy they had all helped build, Issei found himself drawn, on a series of quiet, unhurried mornings, to simply walking the familiar grounds of Ossel, revisiting places that carried within them decades of accumulated memory. The practice yard where he had first learned to properly wield Drake's strength within this world's particular customs, the garden where he had first spoken openly with Eleonora about feelings neither of them had yet been ready to fully name, the great hall where 7 wedding ceremonies, and later, an entire generation's worth of second weddings, had filled the ancient stones with warmth and celebration. It was during one such quiet morning walk that Aya, now grown into a thoughtful, capable woman with children of her own, found her father sitting quietly beside the garden's small, familiar pond, and settled beside him with the same easy comfort that had always characterized their particular bond. "You have been doing this a lot lately," she observed gently. "Just walking, remembering. Is everything all right, Papa?" "Everything's more than all right," Issei said, smiling at his youngest daughter's careful, perceptive concern. "I've just been thinking about how lucky I've been, is all. Not in some sad, looking back kind of way. Just genuinely grateful, walking through all these places that hold so much of what our family actually built together." He looked at her, something warm and settled in his expression. "You know, when I first fell into this world I thought I'd lost everything. Turned out I was just about to find something so much bigger than anything I'd left behind. I like revisiting these places sometimes, just to properly remember exactly how that whole journey actually felt, one ordinary step at a time." Aya reached for his hand, the same quiet, steady gesture her mother Eleonora had always offered him across their entire shared lifetime. "I am glad you have these places to walk through," she said softly. "And I am glad, more than I think I could ever properly say, that you chose to stay in this world all those years ago, rather than simply wishing yourself back to wherever you originally came from." "Me too," Issei said simply, and together, Father and daughter, they sat quietly beside the familiar pond for a long while, watching the morning light shift gently across water that had witnessed, across so many remarkable decades, nearly every significant moment of this extraordinary family's chosen, faithful story. Chapter 24. It was Ludmila who, some weeks later, proposed the idea that ultimately gave proper, lasting shape to the reflective, grateful season Issei found himself moving through, a formal gathering of the entire extended family's own accumulated stories and wisdom, not merely for the benefit of scholars or future kingdoms studying the Accord's careful lessons, but simply for the family's own sake, a proper, thorough record of everything this remarkable journey had actually meant to the people who had lived it most directly. Issei has already documented the trials and the crises, Ludmila explained, presenting her proposal during a quiet family council. But I do not think anyone has yet properly gathered the ordinary moments, the quiet mornings and small kindnesses that actually built this family's true foundation. I would like to help create that record, not as formal history, but simply as our own family's treasured memory, something our grandchildren and their own children might someday read and understand exactly what made this life so completely worth living, beyond the battles and the ancient courts. The project, once begun, drew contributions from every corner of the family, each wife offering her own particular memories and reflections, children and grandchildren adding their own perspectives on growing up within such an extraordinary, chosen family, and Issei himself, spending long evenings across several months, finally setting down in careful, honest words exactly what that first disorienting fall from one world into another had actually felt like, and exactly what he had discovered. One patient choice at a time, about what home truly meant. I did not know, that very first morning, he wrote, in words that would eventually form the opening passage of what the family began calling simply the home record, that falling out of the sky into a field I did not recognize would turn out to be the beginning of the truest, most complete life I could have ever possibly imagined. I want anyone who reads this, whether family or stranger, scholar or simple curious wanderer, to understand exactly this. Home was never a place I was searching for. It was a choice, made honestly and repeatedly, alongside people who chose, just as honestly, to make that same choice back. Everything else, every trial and every triumph, simply grew from that single, simple, endlessly renewable truth. The home record, completed finally after nearly a year of careful, loving collective effort, took its place alongside the Accord's more formal scholarly documentation in Issei's own growing archive, though its purpose, as Ludmila had always intended, remained something considerably more personal and more precious than mere historical record, a testament, written by the family itself, to exactly what chosen, faithful love could build across a single, extraordinary lifetime, and as this remarkable family's continued story made increasingly clear, across every generation still fortunate enough to carry that love forward. Chapter 25. The completion of the home record brought its own small, quiet celebration, the entire family gathering once more in Issei's great hall to formally present the finished collection, each contributor reading aloud a small portion of whatever memory or reflection they had chosen to include, and it was Marika, Issei's own thoughtful daughter, who offered the collection's final reading, a passage she had written herself, reflecting on what it meant to inherit a legacy she had never personally had to fight for in the same desperate, uncertain way her grandparents once had. I did not fall out of the sky into an unfamiliar world, she read, her voice carrying the same careful, thoughtful precision that had defined her scholarly work since childhood. I was born into a family already built, already tested, already proven capable of exactly the kind of honest, chosen love this entire record celebrates. I used to wonder sometimes whether that meant my own life would somehow matter less, having never faced the same dramatic trials my grandfather and my grandmother and my great-aunts all once faced together. I understand now, having helped gather these stories, that inheriting a legacy is its own kind of trial, requiring its own kind of courage, the courage to carry something precious forward honestly, rather than simply resting comfortably within whatever foundation was already built for me. I hope, whatever trials my own generation eventually faces, that we prove as worthy of this family's legacy as every generation before us has already so beautifully proven themselves to be. The hall filled with warm, moved applause at the reading's conclusion, and Issei, watching his granddaughter accept the family's grateful recognition with the same quiet, thoughtful grace she brought to everything else in her young life, felt a particular, complete satisfaction settle over him, the certain knowledge that whatever time remained to him personally, this extraordinary family's story, and the honest, chosen love that had always formed its truest foundation, would continue forward, generation after generation, exactly as faithfully and exactly as beautifully as it always had. Well done, he told Marika warmly, pulling her into a proud, grateful embrace once the formal presentation had finally concluded. Your grandmother and I built this family out of nothing but chance and choice and stubborn, patient love. Watching you carry it forward, in your own thoughtful way, is honestly one of the greatest gifts this entire remarkable life has ever given me. Marika's answering smile, warm and genuine, carried within it every promise of the remarkable woman she was already so clearly becoming, another generation of this extraordinary family ready, when her own time eventually came, to carry forward everything her grandparents and her parents had built, exactly as faithfully and exactly as lovingly as every generation before her had already so beautifully demonstrated was possible. Thanks for listening.